Hello, just checking it's coming through. Great. Hello, everyone. Just checking there's slight feedback. Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in tonight for Assembly Online. As you probably know, this is the third one of Sarah Lowndes' talks from her series of readings from new artists working outside the city. This one's on Chris Burden and his time in Topanga Canyon. Just a short bio of Sarah Lowndes before she starts. Sarah Lowndes is a writer, curator and lecturer, a research fellow at Norwich University Arts, contributes to the Sainsbury Centre Public Programme and works with the education team at Tide and Tide in Great Yarmouth. Sarah established Kunsthal Chroma in 2017 to enhance the cultural provisions available in Chroma and has since hosted visual arts, music, literature, cinema and performance events. She has recently been co-editing a publication with Nell Pruce at Sainsbury Centre for Visual Arts called Sight Writing, working with local writers to create an alternative catalogue in the Robert and Lisa Sainsbury Centre collection, Sainsbury collection. And also to mention, obviously, fieldwork, new nature writing from East Anglia, an anthology with writing from 40 local authors selected from submissions. A link I'll post in the chat now, along with a link to her website that you can follow up afterwards. I'm now going to pass over to Sarah, and I'll be back at the end to talk a bit more about what we have coming up in the next few events.
Hello everyone, thanks for joining us this evening, and thank you to Assembly House Norwich and to Henry Jackson Newcomb for the invitation to talk to you tonight about my research on Chris Burden and Topanga Canyon. As Henry mentioned, it's from my book, Contemporary Artists Working Outside the City, Creative Retreat, which discusses some of the ways in which contemporary artists in Western Europe and America sought alternatives to city living. Throughout his career, the American sculptor Chris Burden consistently used his work to highlight socio-political concerns, whether using his own body or later recycled industrial materials. In both his early performances and his mature practice, Burden investigated how things work. While in his early performances, the focus of his practice was personal considerations of power, in later years, he shifted his focus of inquiry to external issues of power in works that interrogated systems of monetary value, energy use, warfare, weaponry, and transportation. Chris Burden's practice bridged a number of methods and modes of address throughout his life, but one underlying consistency in his body of work was his questioning of the dominant symbolic order, specifically the messages simultaneously promoted by the American government and the American mass media. He observed, "I don't think my pieces provide answers, they just ask questions. I don't think that's what art is about. It doesn't have a purpose. It's a free spot in society where you can do anything." Chris Burden's early tests of his own physical and mental endurance have been read as strengthening his own sense of self-mastery, while his later sculptural works have been seen as investigations, informed by his interest in architecture, engineering, and physics into areas that perplexed and fascinated him, such as flight. In response to a question about whom he thought artists should make their work for, Burden dismissed the idea that art should be directed towards a preconceived audience or to meet the expectations or desires of others. "You always have to march to the beat of your own drum," he insisted. Burden's move to live in Topanga Canyon outside Los Angeles in 1984 meant that he could self-commission elaborate works that took many years to produce, although as his artistic stature grew, almost all of the works that he made were later acquired by museums. Burden's relocation to Topanga Canyon meant that he could live a more private, self-reliant, and expressive life in which his well-being and his creative development were enhanced by his mutually supportive relationship with the sculptor Nancy Rubens capacious studio space, and the outstandingly beautiful surrounding landscape. Chris Burden's life and work had three distinct developmental phases. His years of early student experimentation in Claremont and Irvine, when he produced sculptures that were prompts to action between 1965 and 1970. His years in Los Angeles making concrete performances that tested his own endurance and self-control between 1971 and 1975, and his mature work made between 1975 and 2015, in which he returned to making sculptures but of increasing ambition and complexity. Tropes of absence and retreat played a central role throughout Chris Burden's career, beginning with his early performances in which the artist voluntarily incarcerated or sequestered himself, such as 5-Day Locker Piece from 1971, in which he was locked in a campus locker for 5 consecutive days. The locker measured 2 feet high, 2 feet wide, and 3 feet deep. Other early Burden works dealing with absence and retreat include Bed Piece from 1972, in which he spent 2 weeks in bed at Josh Young's gallery in Venice, LA, and BC, Mexico from 1973, pictured here, which involved paddling a small canvas kayak to an uninhabited beach in Baja, California, carrying only water. He spent 11 days on the beach in 120-degree temperatures before declaring an end to the performance and paddling home. For White Light, White Heat from 1975, Burden revisited Bed Piece and lay concealed on a shelf in a corner of Ronald Feldman's art gallery in New York throughout his 22-day-long solo exhibition. All of these works predated the artist's decision to remove himself from the Los Angeles art scene and go and live in seclusion in Topanga Canyon. These early works are part of a developmental arc in which retreat became not just a temporary condition that Burden enacted for performance, but his way of life. The narrative of Burden's life and work demonstrates how his early experiments into strategies of retreat eventually culminated in late works which were designed to operate entirely in his absence, such as Ghost Ship from 2005 and Urban Light from 2008. Chris Burden was born in 1946 in Boston, Massachusetts, the son of an engineer father, Robert, and a biologist mother, Rhoda. Burden was the eldest of 3 children, and he grew up mostly in France and Italy, where he had frequent opportunities to visit museums and art galleries. However, his childhood was not an entirely happy one. His sister Leslie Burden was later quoted as saying, "We grew up on the outside of society. I think we were very well trained to be antisocial, misanthropic characters, both myself and my brothers. We were constantly traveling, and we did feel different, terribly different." When Burden was a small child, his father's work took the family to China for 6 months, where his own family's wealth, when compared with the extreme poverty on the city streets, left a lasting impression. After that, the family relocated again to live in Paris between 1949 and 1955. Burden's parents separated in 1956 when Burden was aged 10. He recalled, "I was the oldest, so they stuck me in a boarding school in Switzerland for a year. That whole period was pretty traumatic for me." In Europe, Burden first had significant contact with organized religion, which later became an appreciable influence on his artistic practice. He explained, "In Catholicism, you can sin, but you can always do your Hail Marys and get clean again and go back to being the mafia boss. It's weird." From the 1970s onwards, Burden would make numerous performances which made reference to aspects of the Catholic religion, positioning himself as a Christ-like figure in several performances, perhaps most notably in Transfixed from 1974, but also in less well-known works such as Disappearing from 1971, in which the artist disappeared for 3 days and then reappeared on Christmas Eve. Burden would also use the model of the Catholic confessional in several works, including 5-Day Locker Piece, The Confession from 1974, pictured here, and the work called There Have Been Some Fairly Wild Rumors About Me Lately, and I Just Want to Set the Record Straight from 1981. In my 2006 interview with Burden, I asked him about this aspect of his work, and he acknowledged that his work simultaneously referenced and rejected Catholicism. He said, I just play with religious archetypes. In these early works, I just use them as part of a language. I'm deeply anti religious, as it turns out. After Burden's parents separated in 1956, he lived on the Tuscan island of Elba, on and off into the early 1960s with his mother and two siblings. It was on Elba in 1958 that Burden, then aged 12, had a serious accident. I broke my leg and spent a year in hospital because my mother's boyfriend's Vespa turned over on my foot. Following the accident, Burden endured emergency surgery performed without anesthesia on his left foot. During the long convalescence that followed, he became deeply interested in visual art, particularly in photography. Burden explained to me that his accident had a decisive effect on his future, as it both fueled his interest in art and also later gained him an exemption from active service in Vietnam. He related his sense of social isolation during this period of convalescence. I had no friends. My brother and sister were real social because they were younger and going to the local school. I was this freak that was lying in bed with, a big crushed leg. For me, the Vespa accident was an isolation period, and I actually attribute that to when I became an artist. Burden started taking pictures with a Brownie camera his grandmother had given him for his 12th birthday. He recalled, it was a turning point because that's what made my life have meaning. That gave me a reason to get up the next morning. After Burden recovered from his accident, he completed high school in Cambridge, Massachusetts at the Brown Nichols Day School, where he recalled feeling pressure to excel, and where, as Nancy Rubens recalls, he was really being groomed to go to Harvard. However, in the summer of 1963, Burden received a National Science Foundation grant, and he spent 2 months immersed in the beach culture of La Jolla, California. La Jolla must have seemed very different to Burden's hometown, the much colder and more straight-laced East Coast city of Boston. Boston is one of the most European of American cities, walkable and smart, with its university, townhouses, department stores, museums, and well-maintained parks. La Jolla, by contrast, is a place where, as one commentator on Californian life observed in 1965, freedom of movement has long given life a special flavour there, liberated the individual to enjoy the sun and space that his environment so abundantly offered. Owing to the warm climate, there was a pervasive culture of the body in La Jolla that revolved around sunbathing and performing feats of physical daring, as memorably described in Tom Wolfe's surfer story, The Pump House Gang from 1968. On his return from his summer in La Jolla, Burden continued to make plans to study architecture, but not at Harvard. He enrolled instead at Pomona College in Claremont, Southern California. Although Chris Burden was born in Boston, he grew up mostly in Europe. The city that he remains most closely associated with is Los Angeles, which he lived in or within an hour of from the age of 21 until his death, age 69. In 1965, Burden left the East Coast and moved to California to attend Pomona College, just 30 miles east of Los Angeles. Burden started college at a moment of great social change as the civil rights movement, second wave feminism, and anti-Vietnam War protests gathered pace. One Vietnam veteran later recalled that in the mid-60s, everything changed. All attitudes towards power figures, authority figures, respect for authority truly broke down. In college, we were just against everything. During the 1960s, the Californian cities of Los Angeles and neighboring San Francisco also attracted and sustained numerous countercultural groups, including the hippie psychedelic scene, motorcycle gangs, hot rod racers, skateboarders, and surfers. Chris Burden had arrived in California intending to major in architecture, but after a year he changed his mind and he switched to studying studio art under the tutelage of artist instructors John Mason, David Gray, and Maury Baden. Maury Baden's just in the front of this photograph here on the left, wearing the boiler suit. Burden gravitated to the school's sculpture lab, where Baden was producing task-based interactive sculptures such as Seat Belt with Block, and advancing the notion that I am the laboratory and by extension, the art. Burden remembers that the immediacy of the process was hugely appealing. I thought, with this, you don't have to wait, you get an idea, and then you make the thing. That suited me perfectly. Certainly, Chris Burden found that the freeways and beaches of the West Coast offered him a new experience of personal mobility in space, combined with an unprecedented sense of creative freedom. The spacious grounds of his college, availability of industrial materials, and the laissez faire attitude of his tutors meant that the ambition and scale of his work could expand. He said, I remember in college studying minimal art and I was making look-alike Donald Judds. I wanted to make some really big works and I was at Pomona College then. And I got permission from the college to use these abandoned outdoor soccer fields they weren't using. I built these huge sculptures out of basically dead hole and used 2-inch pipe, steel cable, and plastic sheeting and made arches and things. And they were maybe a couple of 100 feet long. They were huge. I don't think I could have done that on the East Coast. Also, different types of material were more readily available in Southern California because of the aerotech industry. In LA, you could make phone calls and find where the source was and could get in your car or truck and you could drive and go and get it immediately. I don't think that's the same on the East Coast. In and around the college campuses, and in the handful of small artist run spaces and forward thinking museum spaces that existed on the West Coast by the late 60s, an ideas based art and a new performance sensibility was being shaped. One important focus of that scene was the newly built Irvine campus of the University of California, 60 miles south of Los Angeles, where following his undergraduate studies at Pomona, Chris Burden decided to study for his MFA between 1969 and 1971 as part of the first intake of students on that course. At UCI Irvine, Chris Burden would be taught not only by the Finnish fetish LA artists Larry Bell and Robert Irwin, but also by Robert Morris, who travelled from New York as a visiting lecturer to the course. All three encouraged him to expand his sculptural work into the field of performance through the participatory sculptures which Burden began making in 1970. Burden began producing apparatuses for bodily balancing acts with elements such as metal handles and stirrups, or a body-sized horizontal aluminium plate fitted with footholds and held off the floor and balanced by a single pivot. Recalling this period, Burden said, I have to explain how I got to performance from minimal art. Early on, I tried to figure out what the difference was between two-dimensional and three-dimensional art. I was trained as a minimalist, so the idea is to keep reducing it to get to the essence. I was thinking, well, what is sculpture to the viewer that's different to looking at two-dimensional work? In sculpture, you have to move around it. The essence of sculpture is bodily movement. So let's do away with the object and get to the real meat of it, which is action. So that's how I got basically from making minimal sculptures to doing performances. From 1971 onwards, Chris Burden conceived of and executed plans that put himself and his audience into what he called that weird grey area, that is, a position of uncertainty. Burden's minimally staged yet psychically intense practice placed an emphasis on direct physical experience, deliberately rejecting the passivity and social isolation engendered by consumer culture. Indeed, all of Chris Burden's work could be seen as being concerned with verifying what he knew firsthand against what he knew intellectually. Burden himself commented that as technology becomes more and more complex, fewer and fewer people have any understanding of how anything really works. Chris Burden remains perhaps best known for works that tested his own ability to withstand fear and pain without reacting, such as Shoot 1971, which is the previous slide, in which he was shot in the arm by a friend with a rifle, and Transfix from 1974, in which he was crucified with nails driven through the palms of his hands into the roof of a Volkswagen Beetle. Burden's early performance works were usually carried out behind closed doors, in studios and artist-led galleries, and only attended by very small invited audiences, and reached wider recognition through the documentation issued by the artist afterwards, a single black and white photograph, and a terse typed descriptive paragraph of what had taken place. The early performance works of Chris Burden provide some of the most notorious, and yet in some respects the least carefully analysed examples of concrete performance of this period. In much of the existing literature relating to his work, the masochistic and aggressive aspects of Burden's early performance works are emphasised at the expense of a more nuanced reading of his complex and often contradictory oeuvre. Although Burden is perhaps best known for his works which involved him, for instance, being shot, electrocuted, impaled, lacerated, or set on fire, he also produced many performance works in which his visibility or lack of was a key aspect of the work, such as Disappearing from 1971, and others which revolved around a self-imposed challenge to withdraw from sight and or remain still and silent, notably 5-Day Locker Piece, Bed Piece, BC Mexico, White Light, White Heat, and Doomed from 1975. In common with his more visible and violent works, these works of retreat also posed a challenge to audiences who often had to decide between intervening and maintaining distance. Burden himself provided a useful metaphor for the way in which his early performances simultaneously exhibited distance from and yet demanded participation from spectators. Burden himself described his immobile body as presented in Bed Piece as a repulsive magnet. When I interviewed Burden in 2006, I asked him about this richly evocative phrase, which encapsulates the negotiation as practiced between positions of introversion and extroversion, passivity and aggression, silence and verbosity. He pointed out a magnet can be repulsive depending on which side the magnet is on. It will either draw things together or push them away. Metaphors of attack and retreat recur throughout Burden's oeuvre as he alternated between strategies of aggression and passivity, literally from one month to the next. For example, the artist discussed the way in which a work in which he demanded aggressively that the audience leave the exhibition space, which was a piece called Shout Piece from 1971, was followed a month later by the work in this picture, Prelude to 220 or 110, a work in which he was presented as a kind of sacrificial victim strapped to the concrete floor with copper bands, with 2 buckets on either side of them, each with live power lines feeding into them. He explained people were angry with me for Shout, so in 110, I presented them with an opportunity to allow me to atone for it. Not literally, I wasn't really hoping that someone would kick the buckets over, but by putting myself in that situation, I was kind of like absolving myself for that last piece, which was aggressive and hostile. In 1972, Burden began to move in a different direction, albeit one that also used his absence as an active ingredient of the work. Dos Equis from 1972 was the first of a number of works in which Burden, like the Wizard of Oz, staged a magical intervention without being seen by the audience. For Dos Equis, Burden drove to Laguna Beach, south of LA, one October evening, where under cover of darkness, he placed 2 X's constructed of gasoline-soaked 16-foot beams in an upright position blocking both lanes of Laguna Canyon Road. Burden set the 2 huge crosses on fire, took a photograph, and left the scene. He reflected afterwards, Dos Equis was just for one person. I don't know who he is or anything. He was just the first one to come upon those big crosses burning in the road. Those fiery crosses must have really burned in that guy's mind. In 1973, 2.5 years after Burden had carried out perhaps his most famous action, Shoot, the work was written about in both Newsweek and Esquire magazine, generating a degree of publicity that ultimately put an end to Burden's performance work. Burden said in a 1979 interview that, I think a lot of people misunderstood because they think I did those violent pieces for sensational reasons or that I was trying to get attention. But those pieces were really very private. Often there were only 2 or 3 people there to see them, or maybe the people who were helping me. After making a number of performances dealing with themes of social withdrawal, notably White Light, White Heat, in which the artist remained hidden from view in a New York gallery for 22 days, Burden stopped making performance works. Burden's next significant project was Bee Car from 1975, which he described as the most elaborate fantasy of my life. He was able to realise the work after receiving his first National Endowment for the Arts grant in 1974. However, rather than a test of his own self-endurance, the project was a test of Burden's mechanical engineering skills. He recalled, when I made the little automobile Bee Car, that was the beginning of a change. I liked making things, but I didn't really have the tools and materials. So I borrowed somebody's drill press and I made this in my little shop. In 1978, Burden began teaching at the University of California of Los Angeles, where he worked for the next 28 years, meanwhile producing sculptural work, which the New York Times described as things a manically committed hobbyist might labor over for years in his backyard workshop: elaborate scale models of steel bridges, 40-foot skyscrapers made wholly of erector set pieces, immense military dioramas, miniature metropolises swarmed by hundreds of speeding toy cars, a vision of urban horror or utopia depending on your perspective. From the mid-1970s onwards, Chris Burden had started to receive financial support from such sources as the National Endowment for the Arts. Between 1974 and 1983, he received 4 NEA grants, and he was also beginning to win commissions and sell his work through Gagosian Gallery. When Larry Gagosian opened his first gallery in Los Angeles in 1980, Burden was one of the first artists on the roster, and from the late 70s onwards, Burden worked on a slow but steady schedule of exhibitions and installations, culminating in the first major retrospective of his work at the Newport Art Museum in 1988. He remembers, I did pretty well in the 80s because there was so much money churning through and everything was popping. There was a lot more opportunity for guys like me who aren't marketable. By 1981, Burden was able to buy a plot of land in Topanga Canyon, an area I'd long enjoyed escaping to, where he went hiking for hours on end. Burden recalled, when I first bought the land here, you couldn't drive here, you had to walk. So you had to park your car about halfway down the road and then you had to walk back. So there was nobody here, absolutely nobody. Burden's plot of land lay within the largest wilderness area within a city limit in the United States, accessible by just one route, the Topanga Canyon Boulevard, which winds for 12 miles from the ocean to the San Fernando Valley. As LA-based writer Susan Morgan relates, it's not hard to understand what draws so many artists to Topanga: wild, wide open spaces, enforced solitude, and an atmosphere that teeters between insular and inspiring. Topanga Canyon had attracted artists of all sorts since at least the 1950s McCarthy era, when Will Geer, a blacklisted actor and trained botanist, fled Hollywood and bought a parcel of canyon land where performers at his open-air theatre included Arlo Guthrie, Pete Seeger, and rambling Jack Elliott. Visual artists had also long been attracted to the country living close to the city afforded by the canyon. Beat artists George Herms and Wallace Berman, pictured here, lived in the rustic and secluded canyon in the 60s and 70s, where both developed their mystical, poetic sensibility through assemblage art and esoteric hand-printed publications. For Berman in particular, living in Topanga bestowed increased creative freedom and privacy. As the poet David Meltzer notes, his autonomy and marginality became an asset, enabling him to move effectively in and out of circles that would otherwise entrap. Topanga Canyon also had a history of attracting musicians. Folk musician Woody Guthrie, members of the Doors and the Eagles lived there at times, and Neil Young penned most of his album After the Gold Rush from 1970 while living in the area. It was said that Jim Morrison penned Roadhouse Blues on his way to play a gig with the Doors, a noted 1960s venue, the Topanga Corral, when during the hippie era also played host to Little Feat, the Flying Burrito Brothers, and Canned Heat of Going Up the Country fame. By the early 1980s, when Chris Burden bought his plot of land in Topanga, he was growing more involved in model making, an interest that generated A Tale of Two Cities from 1981, a miniature reconstruction of two warring city-states featuring more than 5,000 war toys from America, Japan, and Europe, which could be viewed in detail only through binoculars. Like the eponymous hero of Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, Burden loomed over his Lilliputian peoples, who revelled in displays of authority and demonstrations of power. As Roberta Smith wrote regarding his work from the early 80s onwards, in his sculpture there is a recurring emphasis on war and its instruments, usually to make a case for peace. Meanwhile, through his teaching at UCLA, Burden was influencing a new generation of artists through heading the new genre art department. The sculptor Liz Larner remembers hearing Burden give a lecture in 1981 as a life-changing moment. To a young, uninitiated student, the idea that what he was doing had anything to do with sculpture was mind-expanding. The chasm of possibility opened up. It was at UCLA in 1983 that Burden met the sculptor Nancy Rubens, who was also teaching at the school. She recalled, "We were all friends, and University of California paid well at that time. And you could go teach your class for 2 days and have a nice relationship with the students who were happy to be working with active artists, and then return to your studio and do your own work. It was really kind of nice." Indeed, Burden proved the willingness of his students to work with him in his performance work, The Hard Push, from 1983, which was staged on the UCLA campus and consisted of the artist being tied hand and foot into the center of a large plywood wheel 9 feet and 4 inches in diameter. He then asked the gathered students to push him from the bottom to the top of Bruin Walk, the main pedestrian thoroughfare which goes up a steep hill for approximately 500 feet. After Chris Burden and Nancy Rubens' relationship began, they often drove out to visit the parcel of land that Burden had bought in Topanga together and go walking in the hills. Rubens recalled, "When I first met him, he would go and visit the land at Topanga, and there was no paved road, no electricity, and it was at the end of a rotted out dirt road. It was just beautiful. So we hiked around and visited the land over the first year we were together, and we became a couple immediately." In 1984, Rubens accompanied Burden when he traveled to New York to install an exhibition at Ronald Feldman's New York Gallery, and later that year, the couple moved out to live in the canyon together. So this is Nancy Rubens, who's pictured in this photograph on the last slide. That's her there at Beam Drop, which was a Chris Burden work from that same year. Okay. The move to Topanga with Nancy Rubens heralded a new era of stability and happiness in Chris Burden's life. In later years, he recalled very fondly the sense of adventure that he and Rubens shared in their early years of camping out together at the site. "We had to have a road put in, and after that was done in the spring, Nancy and I started camping out here and spent the summer on a platform I built. We had a spring that worked then, but we didn't have electricity or a phone, and we lived that way for about a year. Then we built these big tents and lived in those for 3 years. It was great. I felt like I was in Montana or something, but we were right next to a city of 12 million people, sleeping outdoors on a piece of plywood." Nancy Rubens said about those early years of living in the canyon, "I think Chris really relished the quiet, and I know those very early pieces that got such huge attention throughout the world, even though when he did them, he often did them in very quiet circumstances. I think it became a real pressure for him to have that kind of attention. And for myself, I'd begun building very large pieces in public places that were sometimes getting too much attention. So it was a nice thing for us." And this is a work of Nancy Rubens here, big billboard from 1980. "So when we moved out to the canyon, it was a nice thing. It was a nice way to start again, to build our relationship. It was like being on a boat." Here we can think of Michel Foucault's description of the ship as being a perfect example of the heterotopia, a place without a place, that exists by itself, that is closed in on itself, and at the same time is given over to the infinity of the sea. Indeed, from 1981 onwards, after he acquired his plot of land at Topanga, Burden began creating a number of assemblage works that took the form of modestly scaled fantastic ships, fashioned from bits and pieces of wood, toys, glass, plastic metal, and electronic circuitry such as Warship, the Nina pictured here, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, ship aux corks, primarily made from 2,700 wine and champagne corks, exploding subs, large glass ship, and small glass ship from 1984. Burden had sailed since he was a child in Boston, and he later said in an interview, I think I was always fascinated by sailboats as a kid because my dad said, that it's possible to sail upwind. Nancy Rubens remembered, like a boat, it was kind of constant maintenance because there was nothing out here. In order to have light, we used flashlights, and we made sure we had a good supply of white camping gas. Then we had oil to run small lanterns. And then in the winter, we figured out you could get these marvelous kerosene heaters. Our place was very drafty. We had lots of ventilation. You could stay very warm with those heaters, so we tried to make sure we had plenty of kerosene there. Endless hauling of stuff. We didn't have a refrigerator, so we had to make sure that in the ice keep there was a chunk of ice. So, it was far from anything that either one of us had ever done. It was really kind of exotic and fun. We had a vegetable garden, and living in California, we were able to see how long tomato vines could grow. They went on forever. So we grew tomatoes and we planted an asparagus bed, and the asparagus was marvelous. Chris Burden was appointed acting associate professor at UCLA in 1984, and 2 years later, in 1986, he became tenured faculty at the school. Thereafter, construction began on he and Rubens' house on the land at Topanga, which would be completed in 1988. Curator Peter Nover from Mac Vienna wrote after visiting the house for the first time. Chris Burden has entrenched himself in the vicinity of coyotes and orange, lemon, avocado groves in a remote and almost inaccessible canyon that is yet separated from the metropolis of LA merely by a formation of hills. Although the site had idyllic aspects, it was also exposed to the threat of natural disaster, as Nover noted. The uncertainty as to when the next earthquake may strike and the threat of fire, the brush fires that rage almost every year, frequently spread to the edge of his property, force upon the two artists, Chris Burden and Nancy Rubens, an everyday life that is characterized by preventative measures and living with the unforeseeable. Nover then catalogues nervously other risks, including the possibility of coyotes attacking the sprinkler hoses or the household running out of water and oil, concluding the two artists are living in the idyllic subtropical California spaciousness under the anticipated shadow of a potential catastrophe that might strike at any time. It must be said that Nover's interpretation may reflect his own anxieties more than those of his hosts, because during my interview with Nancy Rubens, she never described the house and the surrounding land at Topanga as threatening. Instead, the adjectives she used to describe living there were beautiful, lovely, nice, exotic, interesting, and fun. In the early years of living at Topanga Canyon, Burden and Rubens collaborated on a number of works, notably Sprocket's Moon from 1986 and Monument to Megapolis's Past and Present from 1987, pictured here, both of which were large assemblage works which employed found materials, including airplane parts and bicycle parts. Rubens recalled the great thing about living in Topanga for both of us was not having to throw things away. I had been living in New York and I always had been saving a lot of stuff for my work. That was what I did. But I always had to throw everything away. Or if someone offered me a bunch of free scaffolding, I couldn't accept it because I had no place to put it. But in Topanga, you could keep things. So when we first started living there, we were hauling so much stuff, hauling the gas, the propane, drinking water. We hauled drinking water because we didn't drink the spring water as it hadn't been tested, so we just used it for washing and stuff like that. So we were hauling stuff, hauling bottles of wine, hauling bottles of lots of stuff. We'd look at this stuff and say, this is good stuff. Let's not throw those bottles away. Those are good bottles. We could do something with them. One day we could build. We had all these fantasies about what we could do with all the bottles, like making a beautiful hippie building all made out of bottles. Burden said, one of the reasons Nancy and I have lived up here is so we can just leave lots of junk lying around. It doesn't bother anyone that much. Burden further explained, I save, collect and store many items that are usually discarded, such as wine corks, coffee cans, glass bottles, plastic bottle caps, soap detergent boxes, and metal Coleman gasoline cans. In 1983, Burden had made the assemblage sculpture called Ship of Corks from thousands of bottle corks. 18 years later, he'd make a work he described as being in the same spirit as the Ship of Corks, a construction called Bateau de Guerre, from 2001, built using metal Coleman gasoline cans accumulated over a 6-year period between 1983 and 1989. Burden noted, the gas cans were used by my wife and I when we camped out on our property before our house was built. The cans were saved and stored for 12 years. When I started saving this particular group of cans, I did not know what I would ultimately use them for. Nancy Rubens remembered, Chris would always say, don't throw away the gas cans. And I would say, Chris, it's gas. It's fucking dangerous. And he would respond, it's fine. I'll take the lid off so it's not pressurized. He enjoyed using his knowledge of science to solve problems. So out of those cans, he made that piece, Battle de Guerre, which is now in the collection of the Broad Art Foundation. He built a big battleship out of those cans. The things that the couple kept in Topanga ranged from saving every glass bottle that came onto their land to storing much larger objects, such as a steamroller, canoes, and airplane parts. Rubens said, from that stuff that we collected, flotsam and jetsam, some of it became work and others just good stuff. It did affect the kind of work he could do, and my work already had a certain scale to it, but it allowed me to save material and hoard material in a way that I really enjoyed. There was a marked sympathy between the two artist practices, both of which revolved around using sculpture to investigate the specific qualities of materials and exploit phenomena such as gravity and balance. In 1987, Burden and Rubens were married. Curator Paul Schnimmel noted, Nancy affected him very dramatically. He's calmed down a lot. They have a great marriage. It's a really caring, productive relationship. Burden himself said, being happily married, you have more time to do your art and less time to thrash around. The scale and complexity of Burden's sculptural installations increased as the years passed. For example, in 1987, he completed All the Submarines of the United States of America, an installation conceived and produced with Fred Hoffman's print and multiples company, New City Editions in Venice. The work consisted of 625 miniature cardboard submarines, each representing an actual submarine launched by the US Navy since 1897. As one work in an ongoing series of works by Burden referencing the USA's weapons armory, all of the submarines could be seen as an update on his work, The Reason for the Neutron Bomb from 1979, as his new work included the US Polaris fleet of nuclear submarines, which provided the US with nuclear superiority over the Soviet Union. Some of Burden's most notable installations of the 1980s dealt with undermining the very structure of the museum, such as Samson from 1985, an installation consisting of a 100-ton jack connected to a gearbox and a turnstile, which meant that each visitor to the museum passing through the turnstile put pressure on the museum walls. If enough people visited the exhibition, Samson could theoretically destroy the building. Another work of institutional critique made by Burden in these years was exposing the foundations of the museum, in which Burden removed a 52-foot by 16-foot section of concrete floor along the northeast wall of the Museum of Contemporary Art in LA. 3 excavations 9 feet deep by 16 feet wide were made in the earth to reveal the concrete footing which supported 3 steel columns. Burden also provided 3 staircases for viewers to descend and closely inspect the exposed foundations of the museum where the concrete met the earth. In 1988, the first major retrospective of Burden's career was staged at the Newport Harbor Museum, an event that consolidated his professional standing and enabled him to fund the ongoing building project at Topanga Canyon. However, the 3 very positive events in Burden's life between 1987 and 1988, his marriage to Rubens, the 20-year retrospective of his work, and the building of the house in Topanga Canyon, were tempered by 2 severe losses: the deaths of his younger sister in 1987 and his younger brother in 1991. Burden said of losing both his siblings, "It made me feel lonely, more conscious of mortality." After Burden and Rubens' house in the canyon was completed in 1988, Burden's focus shifted away from off-site interventions and more towards producing ever more complex and dramatic sculptures at Topanga, which he often developed over a number of years and which frequently reflected on militarism, heavy industry, and consumerism. He told an interviewer in 1992, "I often stay out here for days at a time without going into town. Going down to the mailbox is a big event out here." Between 1988 and 1990, Burden worked on Medusa's head, a 16-foot, 5-ton sphere which is encrusted with intertwining knots of different scale model railroad tracks and trains and buildings. In an obvious reference to the terrifying Greek goddess Medusa, the sculpture is a metaphor for a world engulfed by its own technology. Burden had begun making the sculpture in the living room of his new house, but by the time the plywood frame was finished, it was so heavy that the house was making weird noises. Burden and his chief assistant on the project, Tim Quinn, maneuvered the sculpture outside and into a shed on the drive. "I thought it was going to take 3 or 6 months to make the thing," he recalled. "It took 2 years and a lot of money, $250,000, as much as my house cost." Medusa's head, which Burden described as an ecological nightmare that failed to occur, which was the 19th century nightmare of the world being taken over by railroad trains, was the centerpiece of the Los Angeles Art Survey show Helter Skelter at the city's Museum of Contemporary Art. Helter Skelter was the first in a series of survey exhibitions about LA art staged from the early 1990s onwards, both in the city and elsewhere, as the art world acknowledged the distinctive and vibrant art emanating from the West Coast by artists who come of age in the 60s and 70s, such as John Baldessari, Ed Ruscha, Mike Kelly, Mary Kelly, Paul McCarthy, Chris Burden, and younger artists who emerged in the 1990s, such as Catherine Opie, Laura Owens, Liz Larner, Jorge Pardo, Pay White, and Andrea Zitzel. As Giovanni Intra, who was one of the founders of LA artist-led gallery China Art Objects, observed, "LA is not so much a city full of alternative spaces, but an alternative space in itself, a perpetual frontier, peripheral to the financial and museological center of the US art world, New York, but still possessing a vitality that would be embarrassing to ignore." Curator Paul Schnimmel, in the exhibition catalogue for Helter Skelter, wrote, "Increasing globalization and changing economic conditions make it apparent that there will never again be singular cultural centers in the way that Paris and New York once were. In fact, it's clear that there are to be many centers, with LA playing a prominent role in that international circuit." Although Burden had been instrumental in building Los Angeles' reputation as a creative center, not only through his artistic practice, but also through his teaching of new genre art forms at UCLA, his living situation at Topanga, almost 50 miles and at least an hour's drive away from the city, meant that he was able to reflect critically upon the city with more literal and imaginative distance. Los Angeles would become the focus of a number of Burden's works in the 1990s, quite possibly inspired by the lengthy, scenic hikes he began taking around the canyon with his dogs, which gave him new views on the city. In 2006, Burden wrote a proposal in which he explained, "I live in a rural section of Los Angeles, and several times a week for the last 15 years, I hike with my dogs into the hills and along a dirt road that follows a ridge line. There are no houses and usually no people on this 1 hour walk. The road dead ends at the top of a small mountain and has a 360-degree view stretching from the Los Angeles basin to the Pacific Ocean and the San Fernando Valley." In 1990, once Medusa's head had left Burden's living room, he had more space to begin another work, Pizza City, 1996, a 1 to 220 scale model which would engross him for the next 7 years. He explained, "The original idea was a harbour going to a downtown section with some high rises, older buildings, the main train station, and then breaking off to an industrial zone and to a skyscraper zone and a mountain. Pizza City eventually spread across 25 table-high modules, 70-foot long by 30-foot wide, which the artist described as an imaginative fantasy, a spiritual model of Los Angeles." Fred Hoffman remembers the slow genesis of this artwork that began as play and wrote, "I would venture to note that had he started with the idea of an artwork, the resulting accumulation could never have contained the feeling of immediacy that the final work conveys." Pizza City like many of Barden's later works, drew upon childhood occupations, but realised with an intensity of focus and a scale that would be beyond child. For example, to build his metal constructions of Meccano and Erector, such as the bridges from 1997 to 1998. In some cases, Barden bought up all of the existing supplies of antique Meccano construction parts available in the world. The 1968 Huber road grader, which became the Flying Steamroller, was on Barden's land at Topanga Canyon for several years before it made the transition to an art object in 1996, a project Barden described as being the culmination of interests he'd held since childhood. The steamroller had originally been used to level roads and runways in the Vietnamese jungle before ending up in an American junkyard, which was when Barden happened upon it. He remembered, I didn't know what I was going to use it for, but I knew it was too wonderful an object to pass up. In 1996, following an invitation from the Mack Museum in Vienna, Flying Steamroller was eventually repurposed as a huge sculpture by attaching the 12-ton steamroller to a pivoting arm with a counterbalance weight. To achieve the flight aspect of the work, the steamroller was driven in a circle until its maximum speed was reached. At the same time, a hydraulic piston was activated, which pushed up the beam from which the steamroller was suspended, causing the steamroller to lift off the ground and fly for several minutes. In 1999, Chris Barden was asked by an interviewer, how do you relate to the art world and its demand for novelties? Barden's reply demonstrated how his studio at Topanga had given him a greatly increased sense of autonomy and creative freedom. He replied, well, I'm older, so I'm more confident. I don't have to shout so loud because I have a voice now. So in a sense, I'm more free to make something that is quieter. I have this fantasy of just making work for myself without showing it in a gallery or a museum. I have a job, property, and tons of ideas for projects on my property. And maybe, if I like you, you can come and see it someday. If not, you can't. Indeed, in the early 2000s, Barden began making a number of highly complex works that were self-commissioned. While iterations of these works did eventually end up in museum collections, the work stemmed from the artist's own interests and were realised because he now had sufficient time and resources to realise his ideas independently. One such project was the miniaturized version of the complex transportation network of LA that Barden called Metropolis in 2004, an intense and complex kinetic sculpture modelled after a fast-paced, frenetic modern city. The armature of the model was made from steel beams, interwoven with an elaborate system of Hot Wheels roadways and monorail trail tracks on which tiny toy trains and trains continuously travel. The noise, the continuous flow of the monorail trains, the speeding Hot Wheel cars, and the random car crash produces in the viewer the stress of living in a dynamic, active, and bustling 21st century city. Indeed, the freeways of Los Angeles, once the route to spiritual freedom, eulogized by Rainer Banham, had become hopelessly congested by the mid-2000s. The freeway system, largely completed by the mid-60s, had functioned well for 10 years before the rapidly expanding volume of traffic made the freeway less a space for freedom and contemplation than a claustrophobic and ineffectual snarl of blocked routes. By the year 2000, traffic in LA was moving at roughly half the speed that it had in 1980, a mere 17 miles per hour. By the time he made Metropolis, Chris Barden had spent 40 years navigating blocked freeways of LA, getting stuck in traffic jams, and witnessing random crashes. When I first met Chris Barden in 2005, shortly after he'd completed Metropolis, he told me that the gridlock in the LA area was now so severe that he avoided unnecessary car journeys, and when picking up groceries, he and his wife bought in bulk in order to extend the time between supermarket trips. He said with a wry grin that their multitude of purchases often caused the cashier to ask, "Are you guys having a party?" However, in Metropolis, Barden could control the flow of traffic, and under his master plan, each of the 80 tiny Hot Wheels cars could travel around the tracks of his constructed miniature city at a scale equivalent of 240 miles per hour. Barden and his team fitted each car with a custom-built bumper and a magnet to hold it on the tracks. Like Barden's bridge works, made from Meccano and Erector sets, Metropolis transformed a modest and handleable child's game into a work of impressive scale, complexity, and ingenuity. Burden later made an even more elaborate expansion of this original work in Metropolis 2 from 2011, which is now in the collection of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Burden reflected people see these works and they assume it was a commission, that somebody asked you to make this and they had the financing behind it to begin with. They can't believe you've produced this on spec, which I never really thought about. Do you know what I'm saying? I mean, to be honest, Metropolis was a bit of a stretch for me. It's scary. Because it was such a complex work, it was set up here in Topanga and it took about 6 months to take apart and 9 months to reinstall. By the mid 2000s, the growing fame of the LA art scene was attracting increasing numbers of students to the city's three key art schools, CalArt, UCLA, and the Art Center College of Design. However, with more people moving in, rents and expectations began to rise, and as college costs were so high, a new professionalism began to creep into the scene. As Chris Kraus noted, leaving school as much as $100,000 in debt, it behoved younger artists to make saleable work as soon as they could. Yet the very success of this system changed it at times, unpredictably. Nancy Rubens recalled, once we started building a really great program, that's when the trouble started, because it became so high profile. All of a sudden, the university wants you to go to umpteen 9 million meetings, write papers, sit on this board, that board. And then the students that became attracted to the program were students who wanted to be hot. In November 2004, an event occurred that brought Chris Burden and Nancy Rubens' long teaching careers at UCLA to an abrupt end when a 25-year-old graduate student played Russian roulette in a seminar taught by the performance artist Ron Athey. University officials chose not to suspend the student immediately, a decision that Chris Burden and Nancy Rubens strongly opposed. 3 weeks after the incident, Chris Burden and Nancy Rubens retired from the faculty, partly in protest over what they viewed as the university's over-lenient response. Discussing the events that led to his resignation, Mr. Burden said, "The university in their greater wisdom blamed me. Most of the faculty said, 'Chris, well, what do you expect? Look what you did. Wait a minute, you know. We're the parents here. We have to say no.'" Burden explained that he felt the student's action was completely different in spirit to his closely controlled performance shoot, which had taken place not as a surprise in the classroom, but in front of a pre-warned audience of fellow artists in an artist-led gallery, which they all ran together. When I interviewed Nancy Rubens, she also referred to a sense of parental responsibility in relationship to the students that she and Burden taught at UCLA, saying, "People used to say to us, 'Do you have children?' And we would say no, but we raised thousands of other people's children." The committed pedagogical approach of the two artists undoubtedly had a lasting impact, both on the lives of the students they encountered in the wider Los Angeles art scene. Los Angeles artist Catherine Opie, who taught alongside Burden at UCLA, stated that his impact on emerging artists had been enormous, as he'd launched a new genre program at UCLA that focused on performance art, video, and other less traditional art forms at a time when they had yet to join the mainstream. She added, he inspired students to stretch the definition of what art making was. He allowed them a sense of freedom. There's a huge generation of people out there who were completely influenced by Chris. However, retiring from teaching meant that both Burden and Rubens had more uninterrupted time to devote to sculptural experiments in their Topanga Canyon studios. Burden commented, "Pure science and art are extremely similar in that they're experiments into something that you don't know. So you don't even know sometimes what you're searching for, you're just kind of probing around." In 2005, Chris Burden collaborated with art commissioning agency Locus Plus to realize Ghost Ship, a self-navigating crewless sailboat that made its maiden voyage between Fair Isle, Scotland and Newcastle, England. It was a work that reconciled his Robinson Crusoe-esque piece BC Mexico from 1973 with his later work involving bridges built in Meccano and model ships, aeroplanes and submarines. Ghost Ship was a 29-foot oak and larch boat hand-built on Fair Isle by Ian Best and fitted with remote navigational equipment by staff from the Ship Science Department at Southampton University. The Ghost Ship sailed 400 miles over a 6-day period, arriving in Newcastle on a wet and windy afternoon the day after the tall ship's race had left the city. Burden followed the journey of the ghost ship from land, meeting the boat each evening in quayside stretching from Fair Isle down to its final destination in Newcastle. In an interview with The Guardian, he admitted that in earlier works he would have been lashed to the mast like Ulysses. Ghost Ship revealed the distance that Burden had travelled as an artist since the mid 70s, no longer a sacrificial victim, but the captain of his own remote controlled ship. Between 2000 and 2005, Burden and a small team of assistants were also hard at work on a work that is perhaps his best loved installation, Urban Light. The work had a slow genesis, facilitated by the spacious studio complex at Topanga, and was hugely expensive in terms of expenditure, time, and energy. Burden began collecting the lamps in December 2000, paying $1,600 for two at the Rose Bowl flea market, and initially imagined putting them at the end of his driveway. And then I got more and more of them. I started to see the potential, and I really liked them, and it felt like I was buying a piece of a city. I had some cash coming in, and basically I turned all my profit into the lamps. Burden saw his acquisition of the lamps as an act of historical preservation. He explained there used to be about 40,000 lamps in different cities around California, but they were brutally dismantled in the 1950s and 1960s, and now there are only about 1,000 of them left. Burden eventually purchased all 202 of the lamps that had been collected by the vendor, Jeff Levine. He recalled, "After I bought all the lamps, Jeff Levine, the former owner, said to me, 'I knew you would come one day.' And I kind of staggered a little and realized he meant it as a compliment. He was so happy that I took his vision and I was able to complete it. Because he had a dream of buying a couple of acres up in the Central Valley somewhere with a long driveway, and he was going to install all of his lamps down this long driveway. His parents and his brothers had always been a little bit down on Mr. Levine for being a pack rat and a hoarder and a junk collector, and they were able to witness the unveiling of his former lamps at the LA County Museum, totally vindicating him in the eyes of his parents and his siblings. The process of restoring the lamps was extremely laborious, as the 29 separate components of each individual lamp were not interchangeable, and each had to be taken apart, sandblasted, and painted a gunmetal grey before being reassembled. Burden explained, "So the door from lamp A does not fit on to lamp B, so each one is a custom fit, and it's a special little nightmare." Burden's assistant, Lisa McLaughlin, said, "Fitting one of these doors to the lamps has been a super challenge. We were kind of joking that we might as well have carved them out of marble, the amount of time it's taking for us to do this with these lamps." 3 years after the work was finally completed in 2005, the forest of 202 restored lamps was installed at the entrance of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art at Wilshire Boulevard. Burden's intervention of 202 lamps changed the street corner where it was sited entirely on purpose. He explained, "I've been driving past these buildings for 40 years, and it's always bugged me how this institution turned its back on the city." Indeed, the pattern of urban development in Los Angeles in the post-war period had resulted in a city that reflected the conservatism of high modernist discourse and lacked a centre. This architecturally prescribed withdrawal from community, from social life, had resulted in the city of isolated individuals. This substitution of real encounters with mediated fictions of society was summarized by Robert Venturi in his Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture from 1966, in which he stated that Americans do not need plazas since they should be at home watching television. The genesis of Burden's urban light certainly bears comparison with another LA assemblage landmark, Simon Rodia's Watts Towers, completed in 1954. As Burden's project was similarly laborious, ingenious, ambitious, private, mechanistic, and thrilling. The Watts Towers, a Gaudi-esque even group of swirling steel structures covered in discarded glass and ceramic fragments, were the result of a 30-year-long project by the Italian migrant Sabato or Simon Rodia, which he began constructing in 1924 as a vision of a fantasy community, finally completing the project in 1954 as the Californian suburban housing boom reached its peak. The towers were one of the only monuments in Los Angeles that represented the city's working classes and as such were cherished by the ethnically diverse community of Watts. Rayner Banham wrote in Los Angeles, The Architecture of Four Ecologies in 1971 that Rodia's Watts towers were congruent with a moody characterized as distinctively Californian, writing, in the 33 years of absorbed labor he devoted to their construction, and in his uninhibited ingenuity in exploiting the byproducts of an affluent technology, and in his determination to do something big, and in his ability to walk away when they were finished in 1954, Rodia was very much at one with the surfers, the hot rodders, the skydivers, and scuba divers who personified through the tradition of private mechanistic Satori seeking in California. However, Burden's work also harnessed electrical light in a way that fused fantasy and public symbolism, which was uniquely suited to Los Angeles. The great commercial signs of the city, the neon hoardings and glittering marquees of the Sunset Strip, had previously been described by Tom Wolfe in his own neologism as electrographic architecture, and Burden's urban light took this local tendency to its logical, monumental conclusion, creating both a picture and a representational sculpture. Urban light was both an iconic symbol and a physical temple that drew the public to the building to physically promenade through the illuminated colonnade. He commented, artificial light, a very modern thing, is reassuring to people at night. People feel safe because of light, is what a city is supposed to be, safe after dark and beautiful to behold. In an interview that he gave in 2015, Burden said that he considered the urban light lamps one of his most successful projects. He explained, they're not about me as an individual or my creation as an artist. People just enjoy them and they get great pleasure from them. They couldn't care less who the artist is. And certainly that is fine for me because it means that the artwork is bigger than the maker. Urban light gives a special experience to those who walk amongst the rows of lights. Indeed, the experience is so magical, the installation has been used as a setting for romantic strolls in several recent Hollywood films. Christopher Knight, the LA Times art critic, commented, it's a temple of light. It's become the artistic symbol of the city. It's photographed almost as much as the Hollywood sign by tourists, which is sort of a remarkable phenomenon. Burden's procession was not only for the kings and queens of the silver screen, but for everyone. Urban light did exactly what Burden had hoped. It drew people from all walks of life into the sculpture to walk and feel different under the rows of lights. He said, because urban light is a processional, it's connected to ancient history in our psyche. How many times have you read about or seen plays that have a procession through the cathedral where the bishop and the king abdicate the throne and the queen is crowned? It's part of our psychic history. It evokes the kind of awe we are pre-programmed by the history of Western architecture to feel when we walk through classical buildings with multiple colonnades. Despite Burden's decision to create some distance between himself and Los Angeles by living in Topanga Canyon, urban light is a truly civic work. He said the lamps became the sort of act of generosity, I think. I go by there sometimes at 1:30 at night, and there's people in there taking pictures and frolicking and making out, and kids bouncing off the lamps. Nancy Rubens recalled, you know what he was thrilled about? That it was a place, that it had become a place, that the artist could be anonymous, that it was a place that the city could claim, and he kind of gave it to them. It was now theirs. In 2013, Chris Burden had been diagnosed with melanoma, news that he'd kept from everyone, bar his wife and his closest friends. In 2014, Burden was told that the melanoma had spread and his health was not going to improve. He decided that he did not want to share the news of his terminal illness with everyone outside his closest circle in a bid to prioritize his work in his remaining time he had left. Therefore, when the news broke on the 10th of May 2015 that Burden had died, aged 69, it came as a shock to many. After Burden's death on the 10th of May 2015, the Los Angeles County Museum kept urban light illuminated all night in his honor, stating we are deeply saddened to note the passing of Chris Burden, whose impact on art and on LA has been profound. Chris Burden has continued working up until the end on his final exhibition, Ode to Santos Dumont, 2015, a rotating miniature white dirigible which first flew gracefully in public without its creator on the 18th of May at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. The work was a homage to an inventor almost forgotten by history, the Brazilian aviator Alberto Santos Dumont, who in 1901 had seen his flying machine complete a round trip from Parc Saint Cloud around the Eiffel Tower and back, all in under half an hour, the first contraption to do so. Burden's final project was an exacting and lengthy labour of love. After 7 years of working with the master craftsman John Biggs, Burden had an engine that was a quarter-size to scale replica of an engine that had powered a Zeppelin in 1903, and after a further 3 years, the work was complete. Biggs recalled that when they tested the work in the Topanga studio, there was this moment when the motor cuts out and there's this graceful peel away. It just quietly moves away. I turned to Chris to see his reaction. He was like, wow, there it is, man. That's the moment. Ode to Santos Dumont took his place in Chris Burden's legacy of works, ranging from concrete performance to complex and monumental sculpture, all of which draw attention both to the limits that guide our lives and the age-old magic of light, speed, and the feeling of being free. Thank you very much for listening and being here.
There we go. Yeah, thank you, Sarah, for that. Just trying to open it up so I can see myself too. If anyone has any questions, do post them into the live chat on YouTube. I'm sure Sarah will be happy to answer them. You said you met him a couple of times, or?
Yeah, so I met Chris Burden twice. Once, the first time was in 2005. We went to Newcastle to see Ghost Ship, which was amazing, and he was a very charming person, very considerate. I was doing my PhD at the time. It was mostly about him, and said that I'd really like to interview him, and then he very generously agreed to meet me the following year, and I met him in London, which was when the Flying Steamroller was being shown at Chelsea Art School, and I interviewed him then. And I hope that it kind of came across in my talk, but he was very funny, great company, and so that was fantastic that I had that chance to meet him twice. And then for my book, Nancy Rubens was also really generous and agreed to be interviewed. So I found like both of the artists to be very warm, very generous sort of people, and really grateful to them, for kind of sharing this kind of information about their lives and their working practices, which I find really interesting and really inspiring.
Yeah, and there's something very nice about an understanding of wanting to make these kind of personal works, which later people kind of assume are kind of attention grabbing, but are very much not that. Kay Pallister is saying, great job, Sarah. Don't know, there's a slight time delay, so I don't know if people anyone else would like to say anything. There was something I was going to ask earlier, but I couldn't write it down anywhere. I can't remember. Someone's just said, Sophie Meow says, thank you, Sarah, for your talk. You referred to Burden's early performances in terms of retreating. Could you expand on your use of this word? What do you feel he was retreating from?
Yeah, I think the thing that interests me about those works of retreat. So those were mostly the things where he kind of had himself locked up or he hid in various ways. I find them quite interesting because I think he's often characterised as being an artist who's interested with violence and aggression. And to me, I always felt like it was a bit of a misrepresentation because there was an interchange between those two different positions. So I think he kind of talked about how he did this piece called Shout Piece, where he invited people to come to a space, and to see a performance. And then when they got there, he was up in the rafters of this gym and shouting at them like get out immediately, and sort of put like bright lights in their face. And understandably people were annoyed about that because they'd made an effort to turn up and support him. So then a few weeks later he made this piece where he had himself kind of like fastened onto the floor, and with a real risk of being electrocuted if anybody wanted to electrocute him, which thankfully they didn't. And so I think that there was always this negotiation in his early performance work between these pieces that were to do with physical endurance, so things like setting fire to himself or having himself shot, or all these kind of sort of self-harming, we might characterize them as those kind of works, with these works that were much more about a kind of mental stamina. So like one of the last works that he kind of made like that was this piece called Doomed that was at the museum in Chicago, when he asked the museum to provide him with a big sheet of glass and a clock. And he just arrived at the museum and lay down behind this sheet of glass. And he hadn't explained this to them, but really the idea was that he wanted to see how long the audience would let him lie there without anybody intervening to think about his well-being. So he lay there for 45 hours before somebody that worked in the museum, and put some water beside him. And although he hadn't shared this with them, the piece would end when somebody intervened. So when that happened, he jumped up and he smashed the clock, and the piece ended then. But really, I think that his work was quite often about responsibility and how we do or we don't take responsibility for other people. And he often talked about his performance work in this way that I found really interesting, called setting up fate, where it was like he kind of entered into a contract with himself and others to say, okay, if you meet me at this art space at such and such time, I'm going to allow myself to be shot in the arm at that time. So it was kind of about, I suppose, putting yourself in a position to do uncomfortable things that most people wouldn't want to do.
I think
So I
also
think,
there's, sorry, there's,
yeah, sorry, go on.
no, I think that the thing that I was going to say before, when I forgot to change the slide, I was kind of staring at that Samson piece with a jack that slowly expands, and also when he was digging into the floor, and not just a way of distancing the work from himself, but it felt like there was this change from doing these very inside emotional, like personal works, to like expanding as far as like what you can do in a gallery, and then how can you push like past the gallery walls or down past the floor, and then sending a remote control thing further away. But it was nice not just thinking of it like distancing himself from the artwork, but from like a set gallery, maybe. I don't know. Somehow.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I couldn't really like do justice to all of the kind of works that he made, because he obviously made a lot of really interesting works that were shown on television as well, which that would be like a whole other kind of talk. So he worked in that realm because he thought that would be a really interesting way of kind of reaching people who maybe weren't a sort of normal art audience. And he also did a number of kind of pieces that were just kind of in the public domain that again would kind of confound people. He made this piece that was called Dead Man, where he lay down in the road and covered himself in a tarpaulin and set up kind of flares round about himself. He also did kind of pieces where he would he glued money to palm trees was another thing that he did. I think all of his kind of like works that he made were really about this, as he said, about asking questions, and this idea about this kind of grey area. So one of his most famous kind of pieces that he made, that I'm sure some people will know about already, this piece, the Other Vietnam War Memorial, was a piece that he made that had these kind of generated names that could have belonged to Vietnamese people that had died in that conflict. And it was as a kind of riposte, I suppose, to Maya Lin's memorial in Washington. But he said afterwards, although I think a lot of people would think that that was a really interesting and very powerful work, he said afterwards he didn't think it was that successful because he said it was too obvious what he was saying. And I think from what I've read about him and his work, he thought his most interesting works were the ones where people continued to disagree or question. So with Shoot, for example, he said, people still get angry about their work, and he said the fact that people are still calling me up and um, complaining or bickering about what that work was and what it meant means that on some level that was a successful work. So yeah.
It's also worth, as I was thinking about how some of that work would have happened in a different time, like how things like that would be perceived now or more recently. Gordon Robertson was saying, "Wonderful, Sarah. Thanks. It was one of those texts I hadn't read in your book. So lucky you met him. What a guy. Real sense of humour too."
Yeah, a real sense of humor, quite sort of like black humor kind of thing as well.
Yeah, I'm really into it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, some of his work I think is quite surreal. Like he had this one piece that was called Velvet Water, that which involved him. He said, "Tonight I'm going to drink water, which is the opposite of drowning." And then sort of engaged in this kind of course, completely impossible like feat of trying to kind of inhale water, which obviously you can't do. But he had, I think, like that piece Dos Equis was really like quite surreal as well. And I think that comes down to this kind of desire that he seemed to have to make these kind of magical things that other people could see, like that were fantastical. That's why I kind of mentioned them being a bit like the Wizard of Oz or something, with like the flying steamroller is a good example of that. You sort of think, you sort of see it think happen. You think, how is it possible? So he obviously went to such lengths. Like with the final work, for example, that was years and years of work just to make that magical thing happen.
And also, interesting you saying that I didn't realize before that he's anti-religious, as he says. Like I kind of assumed they were religious works without knowing. So interesting to hear him say.
No, I mean, I think when he kind of talked about it, it all kind of stemmed, I think, from he went to this kind of Swiss boarding school, where he sort of noticed very different kind of behaviour amongst some of the people that were there, that were Catholics and others that were Protestants, that he found kind of a bit sort of, I think he found the whole like confession ritual kind of odd. And then when he was on Elba, his brothers and sisters went to this Catholic school and he didn't, and they were taking part in kind of religious services and things, and he was sort of outside of that. And so I think that one of the things he was really good at doing was observing things and then kind of mirroring them back in a way that was kind of very striking and funny. I mean, that title of that piece, there's been some fairly wild rumours about me lately, and I just want to set the record straight, is such a great title for a piece of work.
Yeah, I enjoyed the more humour than I'd realised in his works before.
Yeah, because he's just often characterised in a quite stereotypical way, I think, and I just think for an artist like him that he had so many, a bit like Agnes Martin actually that I talked about before, like she had all these different phases in her career, and so did he. He went through all these different evolutions as an artist, and so kind of like complex and always kind of reinventing himself and always developing and growing. And I think it's kind of really
Mm.
nice just to try and see some of the complexity of his work, although I obviously couldn't say everything about everything because and I feel like I've been reading about and thinking about him for about 15 years, and I still find out more things about him all the time. Still find him really interesting. And I also find it really sad that he died so young because I feel like he obviously had such ideas and so much potential, like all these glass bottles that they'd been collecting on the land. He'd said in one of his sort of late interviews, we still don't really know what we're going to do with all those bottles, but we'll do something with them. And so I sort of, that's also kind of, I thought that made me sad that there were lots of projects and ideas that I'm sure he would have created if he'd had a bit more time.
Yeah, I hope I find something to make with all the things I keep collecting that I think would be good for something at some point.
Yeah, I'm sure you will.
Yeah. Still at the finding uses for things stage.
Yeah, and also I think it's kind of important to kind of acknowledge the fact that part of the reason why he said this himself, why he made those very minimal early sculptures is because he didn't have like huge cash resources when he was like a young student and a young artist. And then as he so he was just making things literally like with his body and with a camera to document it, with the help of his friends. And then as he kind of got older and he had very important support from Gagosian, I think was very important in supporting him and his work. And he started to get support from the NEA and from exhibitions, commissions, sales and things. That made it possible for him to move from being this kind of minimalist artist to being somebody who did work with on a bigger scale and with more materials and with the support of assistants and things like that. And I think that's interesting too, because he was interested in the same kind of things, but he just found expression in different ways because of what was available to him.
As I mentioned to you beforehand, I think that I'd kind of paired him in my mind with people like Roman Singer, who more do kind of video works and less photos, where you were saying that he spoke about his way of often doing an event and then just having a black and white photo with a description as the kind of that's the way that people found out about it. But they were very much like factual descriptions that not, even if the titles might be humoristic, they weren't. It wasn't a made up of it. He wasn't making up things. If that makes sense. It's not a question really. Just
no, they were quite factual. Just like at 8 o'clock I went to my studio, lay down on the floor. My friend put some sheets of glass on my shoulders, or whatever it was that he did. They weren't sort of described in a kind of hugely kind of emotive way. That made them more powerful, I think. So, and also he usually used black and white photographs to document his work. So, for example, one of his pieces that he was shown on television, Through the Night Softly, it was him crawling in his underpants across broken glass in the parking lot, and he chose to use black and white footage and photography to document this because he said he didn't want to show the blood. He wanted like the glass to look more like stars or something. And that was really interesting when Locus Plus a few years ago, who commissioned Ghost Ship, they brought out this fantastic, really in-depth catalogue of his work, and that included lots of colour photographs of these pieces like Shoot and Transfixed and Through the Night Softly. It was really weird seeing them in colour because the way that he'd always presented things was in black and white. So he had a very interesting aesthetic. Really interesting.
And even creating distance from the event at that stage, then creating distance from the automatic reaction from it. Wonderful. Well, maybe I'll wrap up if there's nothing else from the chat. So, well, thank you, Sarah, for that again, for the third reading from the book. And you mentioned that it might be coming out on paperback too. Yes. Do you want to mention?
It is, yeah. So So the book that I've been reading from, this here, so far it's only been available in hardback, but I'm really pleased that Routledge are going to bring it out in paperback edition this year, which will mean that it's much more affordable, and hopefully more people will get a chance to read it. So that should happen hopefully before the end of the year. So that's good news.
Great. Just on the upcoming events for what we have for Assembly Online, we've got events now going up to the end of November. The next event will be an international poetry reading with Sebastian Bronson-Body from USA, Maria Seledmore from UK, Adedo Agora from Nigeria, and Fatima Zahara from UK and Pakistan. Following that, we have Jess Fernie, who will be discussing her project Archive of Destruction, and then she'll be discussing it with one of the artists that she's been looking at for that, whose name I don't have in front of me. Then we'll have Off and By with Jonathan P. Watts, yet to be announced, and then original projects on November 26th with who are based in Great Yarmouth and just opened a huge new space in Debenham. It's really worth checking that out if you haven't seen it yet. Lots of amazing things will happen there, I'm sure. Yeah, thank you for tuning in. And Rose is just saying thank you, Sarah. Look forward to reading it in full when it comes out.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, and see you all in a couple of weeks.